That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons a podcast shall rise. H.P. Lovecraft, Weird Tales, Ramsey Campbell, Cthulhu, Laird Barron, Silent Hill, Brian Lumley, Dagon. There's something sinister out there in the cosmos, and the tendrils run deep throughout the universe. Only one woman dares to traverse the web. Mary SanGiovanni, who once again is up to cosmic shenanigans.
Hi folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and once again I am up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions and somewhat surreal proportions, actually, this week. This week I want to talk about I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's a short story, but it's a long short story. I wouldn't say it's quite a novella, but maybe a novelette. It's a long short story called Leapers by Robert A.W. Lowndes. Now, Leapers originally appeared in a shorter form as The Leapers by Carol Gray in the December 1942 issue of Future Fantasy and Science Fiction. It was reprinted in the version that I read it in the Magazine of Horror as a revised version, and that was the September issue, number 23, I believe, of 1968. I could be wrong about that, but I think it's 1967, 68, something like that. Anyway, as a young fan, see, there's a lot of connection to, although Lowndes was, I think, primarily known as a science fiction writer, there's a lot of connection to Lovecraft. He was a horror enthusiast, particularly of cosmic horror, where I think that a lot of times the overlap between science fiction and horror is maybe most evident. And as a young fan, he received 2 letters of encouragement from Lovecraft in 1937. Those 2 Lovecraft letters were reprinted in Crypt of Cthulhu, Volume 8, Number 3, in the February 1989 issue, which was a special issue devoted to Lowndes. The Leapers, Lowndes said, was inspired by Lovecraft. Now, the Crypt of Cthulhu tribute issue also reprints Lowndes' Lovecraftian stories, Leapers, the original shorter version, and the revised version that I read in Magazine of Horror, and a third and final version with a new intro by Lowndes explaining its publication history. There was also another short story in that issue called Settler's Wall, and a number of Lovecraftian poems, The Burrowage Beneath, Forbidden Books, which appeared under a pseudonym of his in 1941. There were 2 critical articles by Lowndes, which first appeared in Magazine of Horror, and an essay on Lowndes, which was called Lowndes, Lovecraft, and the Health Knowledge Years by Mike Ashley. So there's a lot of connection in his work, I think, to Lovecraft, who inspired him, and to cosmic horror in general. In discussing this, actually, with Brian Keene, he brought up a good point that this is perhaps a prototypical Bizarro story. There is an element, I think, of surrealism in here that, despite cosmic horror's embracing of a lot of surreal concepts and a lot of surreal techniques, doesn't always necessarily fall squarely into surrealism per se. I think, in my opinion, surrealism tends to accept, as to a certain degree of normalcy, the bizarre, the outre, the outside, as being part of normal life. And once you sort of get past the hump that, oh, this is the way this particular world works, that's very, very strange, then you can get on with what the actual story is about. In cosmic horror, I think part of the element of the cosmic horror, the horror aspect of the cosmic horror, is the fact that this strangeness is being revealed perhaps for the first time, or, for that particular character, maybe for the first time in a significant way. This story, I think, it uses surrealism in a way that is a little bit of both. And we're going to come back to what I mean by that, by the normalizing of a certain phenomenon, and what I think that really means in the context of the story, why it is done that way. Leapers, in my opinion, is in some ways traditionally a Lovecraftian horror story. And it's also surprisingly different, surprisingly modern, for having maybe only existed perhaps 10 or 15 years after Lovecraft's work himself. You have a certain Lovecraftian elements, like the forces from the outside battling endlessly through the cosmos, and that, in particular in this story, that balance between two of these forces is the only factor that is really maintaining humanity as we know it. Humanity is basically just pawns in this particular game, little chess pieces that are being moved around, and that this particular arrangement is okay so long as nothing upsets that particular balance, nothing upsets that situation as it is. Whereas in Lovecraft, a lot of his work, the quest for knowledge ultimately ends in destruction. It is essentially suggested in this story that the quest for knowledge here elevates humanity. It makes the entities, the outside forces, afraid of what we can become, that we may surpass them in power. However, one caveat to that is that knowledge is a shift in the balance, which would automatically draw us into this particular battle. Now, let's talk a little bit about these cosmic forces, because of all the elements in cosmic horror that we ever talk about, where they're either, used directly as Lovecraft used them, or they're, changed up a little bit, they're subverted in completely different ways, whichever ones are present or absent, there is always a sense of cosmic forces greater than humanity, cosmic forces that will dwarf humanity. And often in the dwarfing of humanity, there's a reduction in the significance. And that is present here to an extent, as I mentioned, except that there's a chance. There's a theory, and I want to back this up a little bit. There's a theory with torture that if for example, if you never let people see the sun who have never seen the sun to begin with, they won't miss it because they don't know what it is they're missing. If you give people a little bit of something good and then take it away, that is much more torturous than to have never given it to them in the first place. And I think that is sort of the principle here, that where we have in not ever having this knowledge, we will never know the difference. And that is true in a lot of Lovecraft's work as well, that we can go blithely through the universe, provided that we never know that there's anything else out there that may upset our worldview. But in Lowndes' story, if we are given that knowledge, it makes us something more powerful. But ultimately, that more powerful thing may or may not be good for us anyway. And we're going to come back to what I find to be the truly horrific aspects of this short story. But first, as I mentioned, let's discuss these cosmic forces at play here. One of the things that I think is very interestingly done, in Lovecraft's work, when we have these cosmic elder gods, we're given these little glimpses in an almost religious fashion, a deity fashion of who these creatures are, what their we can't possibly understand their goals and their drives, but we are given an idea of the kinds of things that they the kinds of messages that they relay to people, the kinds of things that their followers do, that give us a sense of perhaps what their intentions are. That there is ancient writing that tells us that ultimately these old ones will wake up and take over the world again, and basically that they want power. Seldom does Lovecraft ever talk about the other side of that. He does mention that there were warring factions at some point of these powerful entities against their masters and their creators, and that there are creatures that were created as servants to the old ones as well. So you've got sort of different levels of gods and semi-gods and that sort of thing. But there's never a sense of good or evil, right or wrong. Some of these entities being on the side of humanity and some not. There's no sense of angels and demons. They are either all demons or all something in between. That there's no concern whatsoever for humanity because it doesn't affect them that way. In this particular story, we're given two factions which we're told very, very little about. And it's mostly through implication and imagery and symbolism that we come to understand maybe something about these two forces. In fact, we're not even given names. We're just given initials of these particular entities that through paintings and through assumptions, actually. The assumptions that the narrator, the writer of the manuscript that we're reading, is given. Oh, I should mention too that this is in epistolary form. It's like a manuscript inside of a letter, inside of a manuscript, kind of a situation where we're getting second and third hand knowledge of things. But the author of this particular manuscript that seems to have had the most contact, the most firsthand interaction with this great revelation here, he kind of goes through the story as if he knows what they're talking about, and he doesn't really. He never quite finds, I guess, the right opportunity to ask people who these two forces, like who they really are and what they really are and what they really want. But like the readers, he gets enough from sort of symbolism and implication and this assumption by people that he corresponds with that they think he knows who they're talking about, that we start to see this picture emerge of the forces of T, the letter T, and the forces of Y, the letter Y. That T and Y have been engaged in this great battle for eons and will continue to do so for an unspecified amount of time. But what we kind of come to see, T is compared to Prometheus. And if you're not familiar with Prometheus, he was, if I remember my mythology correctly, a giant, something sort of like a demigod, I guess, who saw that, human beings were struggling and wanted to help them, and he gave them fire. And for that, he was punished by the gods because the gods did not want that. They didn't want human beings to have any edge over them that would ultimately cause them to surpass or overthrow the gods. Now, one of the things that Lowndes mentions in the story is that not all forms of Prometheus were punished, and not all forms of Prometheus were at the mercy of other forces. So what we come to find is that T is perhaps the closest thing maybe that the universe has to a source of powerful entities, powerful cosmic entities on our side. It's never specified that that's the case, but we do get the impression that they are helpers maybe, like almost maybe the equivalent of angels, that there is a certain benevolence on the part of T in terms of having given us a fighting chance against Y, okay? That these books that exist, these secret codes that are buried in even, staunchly Christian religious texts, these dreams of artistic and creative people, like in Call of Cthulhu, that the creations of artists and writers and musicians and other creative people, that inherent code for power to fight back is there. That, maybe it's condensed, or I should say maybe it is distilled and, in its purest form in some of these, ancient books of knowledge, but that T has done what it can over time to lace human experience with the tools that we need in order to survive whatever this conflict between T and Y is. The force of Y, again, it's no more stated that Y is evil than it is that T is good. But we get the impression that the force of Y may be the them and the they, and that's all they're referred to in the story as them and they, with the italics, so that it's a specific and somewhat sinister element that we're talking about here. And the force of Y is perhaps more malignant, more controlling. They don't want us to have power. And it's interesting. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about, the use of, the old dusty book of knowledge here. But whereas in Lovecraft's work, it is almost the machination of evil to get the message out there, and that it's only by blissful ignorance that we manage to survive as long as we have. It's kind of the opposite here. The force of Y would like us to be blissfully ignorant, because then they can keep on controlling us the way they always have. That we are not, despite whatever sentience humanity aspires to, we're not a threat. We are not a force that may tip the balance between T and Y in the favor of T. I think that one of the clearest images in the story that gives us an impression of the battle between T and Y is that there's a character that Grayson, the narrator, the writer of this particular manuscript, he's an old friend, this guy Carradine, and he's a painter. And Carradine had done a series of paintings, 4 paintings, the first of which I believe is The Leapers. And it shows these people with this sort of beatific expressions, these divine expressions as they leap off, the world basically into, this golden bright moon in this beautiful fairy blue sky, as it's described, away from a planet that is starkly and realistically depicted as a kind of hell, with these lakes of fire and unnatural kinds of trees and unnatural looking mountains. It is said that the forms of these bodies, as they are basically ascending into the sky, there's a lot of symbolism there, a lot of religious symbolism behind this idea, that they're forming the letter T, and that the landscape forms the letter Y. So that you have an impression, I guess, of how at least Carradine perceives these two forces. Now, we'll stop a little bit and talk about the main construct of this story, which is the idea of the Leapers themselves. Every so many years, and it is irregular. It is not like every 50 years this happens. I think it happens in 1917, and then I think like 1924, 1942. It's not regular, but there are stories, strange stories, of groups of people going missing at a time. They're usually people between 22 and 30. men and women, sometimes children. In fact, there's a lot of children despite this particular age bracket. And it's implied that it's because children see the world a different way. They see the world the way artists see the world. They see it as full of potential and full of magic. To children, imagination is everything. It controls and defines everything. For adults, you've got the writers, illustrators, musicians, people who are creators, people who are creating, and dreamers, really. And that the people who have gone missing generally fall into these categories, and that a lot of people who have claimed to see them the last time before they disappeared claim that they leapt into the sky, and instead of falling, like they jumped off buildings, they jumped off mountains, sometimes they jumped straight up off the ground, and that they just sort of ascended into the sky until they disappeared. There are stories related to this. I think in one case, a child was intercepted before she actually managed to leap out of the grasp of anybody. Like, she was just jumping, but she was clearing 8-foot jumps, and that's when she didn't have a running start, when she just jumped into the air. There are science articles about wearing iron shoes during the full moon because it negates the drag, the lunar drag, as it was called, this pull toward the sky. There are stories of people gone missing where people they don't call the cops because they're perhaps engaged in illegal activities. They're afraid that someone's going to think that they murdered their family members, but the family members actually leapt into the sky and rose until they disappeared. So that's what's meant by the leapers. And we wonder through most of the story, because the significance of the leaping is sort of sprinkled throughout. It's not clear in the beginning why they're doing this, what they're thinking, what is happening to these people. But we come to find that it sounds like they believe they are jumping to the moon. There is an article that comes out that is transcribed in the manuscript about a man who discovers with his telescope that there is a special weapon on the moon, and that special weapon may indicate an attack, a future attack, or the building of a base of operations for either a domestic enemy, which he claims would most likely be the Nazis because they're the most industrious, or possibly an alien one. Now, it's interesting that Lowndes chose the moon, okay? Lovecraft usually wrote about things outside of our solar system. We've got Yuggoth, which is actually Pluto. We come to find is actually Pluto. But it's interesting that Lowndes chooses the moon because of its immediacy. The world's aware of it, okay? For thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, there's been the ritual worship of the moon as a kind of mother figure in pagan religions. It hasn't really been a site of fear, except maybe during eclipses. But the fact that it is something so close to us is it's an interesting choice. It is not something far beyond the cosmos and starless space, the voids of starless space. It is our very own satellite. It is our very own, the closest celestial body to our planet is the moon. And it is from the moon that it is believed this pull is emanating. Now, how and why, we'll get to that. We'll talk about that. One of the aspects of horror, I think, in this, or perhaps maybe the most powerful aspect of horror, and I think this is relevant particularly now. I mean, particularly within maybe the last 30 years, and especially in the last 10 years, is this idea of how much revelation is actually ignored despite media coverage. If you think about nowadays, all of the articles that come out about, discovering discovering bodies out in space which are clearly not natural. They had to have been made, given the way they move, given the way they are constructed, and yet we hear about it once and never hear about it again. Or, this recent discovery, which we may cover at a future Cosmic Shenanigans episode, of certain emanations from the ground that indicate possibly other dimensions, because they are working from a physics standpoint, they are working opposite the way they're supposed to. The way that they are physically supposed to in this universe. There are countless examples of stories, the stories of the bizarre, people going missing, people murdered, scientific developments in medicine or technology, which you would think would be front page news, would make front page news and be, cures to certain diseases, declassification of UFO documents by the military, certain things that you'd think would be, hey, we just found proof of alien life on another planet, that is mentioned maybe briefly if you know where to look online, and then never again. And there is something sort of terrifying about this. This story was written in 1942, and this is the thrust of horror behind it, that all of these things, okay, unlike in Lovecraft, where if you happen to be lucky and can correlate all the events, you will see this bigger picture of horror, okay? In this, and Lovecraft, the whole point is to rebury this knowledge so that humanity can go on blissfully believing that everything is okay, that provided that all of this information is never put together, we may stand a chance. In this story, it's the opposite. It's, despite modern jadedness and cynicism, we're being given, all of this information over and over and over again. We're being told from 1917 to 1942, there have been numerous reports of these people floating away, of just taking off into the sky and going missing. And this is what I mean about the normalization of surrealism. In this, I think it's being used to show that, it's not even the forces outside of our universe here that are hiding things from us or machinating in this way that they're burying knowledge so that we can't attain any kind of supremacy. We're doing it to ourselves. And to me, that is the most flabbergasting and difficult thing to understand, because it does happen. There's a certain horror in the forgetfulness of the collective human mind, that even the fantastic, even the impossible can be reported and then simply forgotten and simply dismissed because we're more concerned about less important things. We're more concerned about menial things. Another horror, and this I think is sort of Lovecraftian, is that in the end, these people who have gone missing, and these are some of the best and brightest and most creative, and a number of children, which society certainly values, and rightfully so, all of these people have gone missing, but the few who people have communicated with about this, they have an almost cult-like belief that they're going toward an actual sanctuary, toward something good, that this base on the moon, this sanctuary on the moon, is an ascension of sorts, a leveling up of humanity. But in reality, I don't think it's ever really clear whether they're moving toward the forces of T as they believe or the forces of Y. Either way, it's pointed out that they're martyrs of a sort because human bodies are not meant to physically withstand the travel through space from Earth to the moon, except with, not without the knowledge that you can find in certain books like the Song of Yst. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing it that way, but it's spelled Y-S-T-E. Okay? And that's where we get to one final aspect of cosmic horror that is most definitely present here. And also, but it's present in a conflicting way than Lovecraft. And in the little foreword before the short story in the Magazine of Horror, it is mentioned that it was something of a bone of contention between the editor and Lovecraft himself, that Lovecraft believed that reading these books was absolutely naturally, akin to self-destruction. Whereas the editor said, sometimes maybe the knowledge, that kind of knowledge, can be survived. What we get is the Song of Yist, I guess, would be the Necronomicon in this particular case, but it's not, unlike with Lovecraft, this book and others like it are not inherently evil. They are not something that has been culled from information from the old ones, and these evil and degenerate cultists who are basically seeking the destruction of the world for a rebalancing of power. They're not agents or tools of evil, put here essentially to help the old ones come back. They're books which contain knowledge that will shift the balance of power between cosmic forces greater than us. It's implied that the forces of Y don't want that, as I mentioned, because they want to control us. It's also implied that maybe it's the T forces that wanted to give us a fighting chance, so they gave us books like this. They gave us knowledge that certain people in the right conditions could use to elevate the power of mankind. But again, as I mentioned, it suggested that this will change everything. Not in the cataclysmic evil of Lovecraft's tomes, but at worst to the uninitiated, that these books are just boring or abstruse. And again, what I find sort of horrific is that it's often the human race which either roots out and destroys those who have this knowledge or ridicules it. And so, because he basically... the best tool that the forces of Y have is that if we are regressive, that religion's own bid for control through fear will root this out and make people think that they're evil and that they're all going to hell for reading this kind of information. Or science in progressive times ridicules any force that is not scientifically proven, that can be immediately scientifically proven. So you have, again, this idea that humanity is its own worst obstacle in attaining something greater than what we are. And I think there is a very cosmic horror, despite this idea, despite this hope that humanity can be significant, can be more than what it is. Humanity itself is its own undoing. Humanity itself is what is reducing the significance of humanity, just as forces much greater than us want us to do. So there is something sort of, I think, nihilistic about that idea, that in the end it doesn't matter because humanity will destroy itself. It'll eat its own tail. That it can never really be significant because humanity gets in its own way, which is a slight deviation from the idea that cosmic forces, it's more like cosmic forces don't have to lift a finger, that humanity will do everything for them. And I think there is something sort of terrifying about that, about the deliberate ignorance, the deliberate oblivion that humanity continues to place itself under, even in the best and worst of times, that leave us helpless to cosmic forces greater than we are. So that's it for this show. It's a slightly longer one than normal. Cosmic Shenanigans is brought to you by the Brian Keene Radio Network. If you would like to advertise or possibly be on the show or have a suggestion for something you'd like me to discuss on Cosmic Shenanigans, please visit briankeene.com and click on the podcast radio page. That will give you all the information you need in order to do any of those fun things. And thank you again for listening to this episode, and I will see you next week. Bye.
Cosmic Shenanigans is a production of the Brian Keene Radio Network. You can listen to this episode and all previous episodes for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play Music, and wherever else podcasts are available. Cosmic Shenanigans is written and produced by Mary SanGiovanni. Our theme music is by Xander Harris. Our engineer is Matt Wilderson. Check out his books on Amazon.com. If you enjoyed this show, you might enjoy our other podcasts, The Horror Show with Brian Keene, Defenders Dialogue, and Grindcast. To advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans, visit briankeene.com and click Podcasts.